All right, we're starting. We are starting.
I almost want to just make sure that damn snowball is working.
Yeah.
Do we have the control anywhere?
Which one?
No.
Oh.
Just control up on here.
So this is Mr. Jack / Luke Mancini.
I just want to see.
Yeah.
Okay,
So we want to keep this more of like I guess an open sharing kind of setting. So if you guys have questions, just like throw it out there and he'll answer you and talk to you about it and stuff. So please ask questions and pick his brain while he paints.
Yes. I was just setting up my brushes to get, well, my brush to get started before the session, but as Joe so helpfully pointed out, people may actually be interested in that. But I can do it. It's basically this. I make a square. I don't really have to do this very often because I don't really play, unlike some people, I don't really play around with brushes a whole lot.
You talk just a little bit louder.
Yeah, of course. I don't really play around with too many custom brushes or anything like that. So basically, a lot of my work is done with a square brush like this. So I just create the brush preset, and it ends up being this. It has minimum diameter and opacity and direction all controlled by the pen. It's nothing too crazy. But yeah, so I don't have an enormous plan set up for this demo. This is going to be slow, but we'll see where we go. So, and feel free to ask questions.
Is your computer lagging?
Yes, it's impressive, the capability, and this is not that high a resolution really we're working at, but we should be alright. Alright.
You got that square brush, which it's just brush preset.
Alright, so yeah, if I create, you fill in a selected area. Usually you do it black on white. So it's make thing. If you're making a textured brush, you have it within any sort of selected shape because it basically uses the alpha mask of what you've got selected, and it's edit, define brush preset. And so once you've done that, it shows up in your list at the bottom. It'll add the list, and then you have to go into your brush settings and add in all the rest of the stuff because it just comes in as a default brush with no anything else. So I have shape dynamics, size, and transfer opacity set to pen pressure, and the angle is set to direction. So it just follows where I'm drawing. So that sort of thing. So I have a terrible habit of jumping around a lot while I'm painting, so I'm going to try not to move the canvas too much, just so it's easier to follow. So I did do a super rough sketch earlier, so I have some idea of sort of what I wanted to draw. And when I'm just sort of sketching for myself, I jump back and forth between doing a lot of like line work like this to get myself started, and just doing like sort of blocked in shapes. One of the reasons I'm doing line work at the moment is partly because this computer doesn't seem to be able to handle larger brush sizes very well, so it's easier just to use a small brush, but that's not necessarily. I enjoy getting shapes down like this because there's a sort of fluidness, especially when I'm using a square brush. that I don't necessarily get if I'm using like big sort of blocky shapes to block things in. That lends itself quite well to sort of mechanical things like mechs or sort of vehicles or whatever, and not so much to sort of organic shapes, creatures and people. And then the challenge is after that to try and keep some of that organic flow in the final sort of painting once I do start using a bigger brush to start painting areas in. So this is a fairly sort of arbitrary starting point as far as colors go. Let me change that up a little. Whoa. So I use the gradient tool a lot for sort of adding some sort of shadowed variation and color ramps. I tend to have it set, I always have it set to but the foreground color to transparent, just so I can put it over anything and it doesn't like screw me over. And very rarely do I have it more than 10 or maybe 20% opacity, just so I can sort of carefully, or not carefully, but subtly adjust colors, because you don't necessarily need really, it gets a little too overwhelming if you've got it higher than that.
As soon as you flipped it, now I think I see what you're drawing.
I'm not sure if it's just the size of this Cintiq, where I feel like everything I'm drawing is sort of too big for the image. Meaning that I'm not used to drawing on a smaller size. I have to keep shrinking everything down to fit on the frame. Because I work on one of the larger, whatever it is, newer Cintiqs at work. Though at home I still only have an Intuos 3, I think. At some point I'm probably going to end up upgrading that, but for now it does the trick. So this is a little bit of a go-to sort of subject for me, I guess. The creature and it's really annoying. Creature and girl thing, and I think this pose is sort of the almost typical dragon pose that I do, but it's for purposes of demo. Hopefully, will work out. Okay, what am I looking for? Give that red. That was just the color of this, so you can see that I'm. Why didn't it disappear completely? Oh, there you go. So you can change the color of this gray sizing thing. It defaults to a very garish red. So feel free, if anyone has questions or anything.
Luke,
Yeah.
what kind of art influenced you when you were a kid? You do like a lot of paleo art? Where'd you start out?
There was definitely a lot of dinosaurs when I was growing up. I remember that my dad, I don't remember how old I was when Jurassic Park came out, but my dad, I got to skip an afternoon of school and we got to go and see that at the cinema when it came out, and I remember that having quite a big influence on me. And then definitely James Gurney's Dinotopia was an enormous influence. I still have my copies of that, and I still love them. They're just as amazing now, if not more so, because I can appreciate the actual artistry in it better, I guess, nowadays than I could at the time. It's not just awesome dinosaurs. Well, I mean, it is mostly just awesome dinosaurs, but they're still awesome now.
And where'd your sense of like pinup art come out of?
So that I think was probably a result of more American comic book art. I was never I had a lot of friends who were, but I was never really into manga quite so much. But I definitely was really influenced by people like J. Scott Campbell and Joe Mad, and I think I didn't read a lot of actual comics, but I was very selective as far as what I got, because I pretty much only wanted things that was art that I liked. But Battle Chasers and Danger Girl were probably the two like big influences in that position, and then that sort of matured, and people like Adam Hughes and I don't know, and then obviously more older sort of examples of that, like Frazetta and Gil Elvgren, for sure. Though that didn't really kick in until a bit later. But that's definitely something that's been a background.
Why did you choose to jump up to a layer as opposed to staying in the background?
So that I can do some bigger wash sort of areas, like shadow sort of areas, and then be able to erase if I don't think it's quite working, rather than it being difficult to keep the lines underneath if I decide something is not doing exactly what I want it to do, or even not necessarily just if something isn't quite working, but just it's easy to sort of clean things up if I do that and then sort of neaten the edges of it. It's not necessarily because I didn't want this bit, but it lets me be a little looser with where I'm putting the paint, well, the color, I suppose. It's almost a little arbitrary as to when I say, alright, this needs a new layer. And a lot of the time, I can end up being, it gets a little awkward. If I ever use adjustment layers or anything like that, I'll need to start painting on top of that, so I don't necessarily have like, and by the end of it, I'm not going to have like, oh, this is the layer that the dragon's on, this is the layer that the fairy's on, or whatever. It'll just be, this is where this stage of the painting was, and this is where this stage of the painting was. It's a little just more chronological, as opposed to being like, unless what I'm doing really calls for like the final product to be, okay, we need this in layers to be able to move it around or whatever. Otherwise, I'm not super conscious about keeping things too neat and organized.
work, I see you quote reference because you have to replicate designs and stuff like that. But obviously you have a really good grasp of shape and color. When you're just doing personal art, do you find that you're very reference dependent if it's something like this?
Something like this, no. Like, especially something like dragons and just sort of pin-up-y type things. Unless I've seen something that I'm really that I've been inspired by, like someone's other art on DeviantArt, and that's not necessarily so much for actual reference as much as like, oh, that's really cool, and I'll try and sort of just be inspired by a certain type of painting or a certain sort of color scheme or something like that. But otherwise this sort of thing I would just paint and not really worry about having anything else up. But if I'm doing something more like, if I'm painting some dinosaurs, if I'm painting some animals or something like that, I'll definitely get some reference up to see sort of how things work. Or I will occasionally use for like human bodies and stuff. I'll do a little bit of reference. I'll do landscape reference if I start doing backgrounds for something, and I'm not really sure what sort of direction I want to go in. I'll definitely use reference for mountains or clouds or something like that, because there is I mean, I can do that okay on my own, but there's definitely things that you see that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you're just like, oh, alright, I'm going to draw a standard mountain here, and that'll be that.
If you're doing something outside of like a study, do you feel more inclined to just be freeform with it and just wing it, or?
Yeah, I think so. I will. I don't do actual like straight up studies a whole lot, and it's something I do still enjoy doing, and something that maybe I should do more, especially for things like either landscapes or certain just like people, just like certain anatomical things, hands or whatever, that I should intentionally study more probably. But so when I am doing that, there'll definitely be reference up.
Question for you.
Yeah, of course.
What command are you using to resize your brush on screen?
It is Alt and right click. So I've got one of the buttons on the pen set to right click, and then you drag. And just for regular brushes, it's just dragging horizontally will just change the size of it. If you have just a standard Photoshop like circle brush, horizontal is size, and you can drag up and down for hardness, so that can be sort of handy. But a lot of the time when I'm painting just with a square brush, the hardness actually doesn't come into it. But yeah, that was that, and that's something that has only been, I think CS5 started that. So it's one of the biggest like updates that I found actually useful. Along that and rotating the canvas, which I'm trying not to do too much here because I'm trying not to move the canvas around too much, but I use it a heap in my painting. Especially because, I think, and this is entirely just a personal thing, but I've developed, especially on my Wacom tablet at home, there's like an area about an inch square in the middle of my tablet, which is worn considerably more than any other area of my tablet, and I almost think that I basically have my thumb on the space bar and I move the painting around to be on that area, and I just sort of I don't really move my right hand around that much, which is why, as I said, that I end up being a little bit too sort of jerky with my painting, so I'm trying to avoid that at the moment.
You have to paint like a full scene. Do you usually do the subject first or like the background first?
Pretty much always the subject first. I'll depending on whether it's a scene, depending on how finished the final piece needs to be, I will do more or less. Sometimes I will paint a reasonable amount of the background if it doesn't need to be too finished and I'm just trying to set the scene. But if it's something that I've like had to do a reasonable sort of rough line work for, then I'll definitely once I've done the lines, it's definitely like, alright, character time, and then I do that, and then I end up having to do the background later, and usually regret it. But I don't think it's a little bit of a case by case basis, but yeah, usually characters first. So like that. So this is another situation where I'll end up with a new layer because I wanted to move the arm, but I've got part of the arm is here and part of the arm is on this layer. So I select it, I do a Control Shift C, which is copy merged, and then just paste it, and so now I have the arm on a new layer, and I can either flatten this down into this layer, which I will do, or just leave that as a separate layer and start painting on top of that. I don't really like leaving too many layers up. Like, my final files very rarely have more than, say, 4 or 5 actual painting layers. There'll often be like effects layers or adjustment layers at the end that bump that number up depending on how I feel it's turning out. But I usually try and flatten things down at least a reasonable amount and not end up with too many crazy different things, because if I do end up wanting to go back and change things, it's really annoying to have to sort through heaps and heaps of different layers. I'm terrible at naming layers too.
Can I ask how you control the tone? Is your painting transparently?
Yep.
So it's layering on top of the previous thing you paint?
Yep.
Are you consciously ensuring that tones are not out of control, or too many levels?
A little bit. It's basically all comes down to just knowing controlling the opacity with the pen pressure, and so I basically always have my brush set to 100% opacity, and so I'm never in a situation where I'm like things end up showing through because I can't paint over them hard enough, and so it's basic. All of my layers end up having sort of opaque to certain levels, just sort of cover ups, and if I do want to keep something, I'll do the copy merged, and just so it ends up on the front layer and I don't end up painting over it too much. As far as like actual getting tones on my brush while I'm working, I use the eyedropper a lot. It's just Alt and gets my colors sort of, so I use the swatches palette and the eyedropper basically to get all of my colors, and then I use D quite a lot as well, which is just sets your swatches back to default, so D makes my brush black again. And I really wish sometimes that you could set custom colors for that, because I always want black to show up, but I very rarely want white to be the background color. But I mean, it is what it is. It's not that difficult to change. And once you're not painting on the background anymore, the background color doesn't really have that much of an effect on anything, so it's not that big a deal.
To make that red blush, did you just use a small circle gradient, or were you
Yeah.
using...
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about earlier, that I have the gradient tool pretty much constantly set to radial gradient, and it's foreground to transparent, and usually 10% opacity, so I can just do a slight gradient, and it'll add just a slight color to whatever I'm doing. So that's the other time when I make a new layer when I'm not sure if something's going to work. I don't know if it did, so let's just leave that off for now. And so this is basically pretty much representative of how I work, especially on something that I'm not super that I don't have really well planned out beforehand. I end up jumping around a lot. I'm not like, alright, I need to finish this bit and then I need to go back and finish that bit. It's all sort of a work in progress at the same time.
Are the color choices intuition, or is there a reason why?
It's pretty much intuition. I'm really not thinking that much about the colors at the moment, which can sometimes end up being sort of a bad thing. And a lot of the time I will end up actually a lot of the time I end up falling back on at least a levels and a color balance adjustment layer at the end, because I'm not, as I've been painting, I think that partly comes from too much color picking on out of the picture itself, and not enough like new brush, new sort of color selection. Things end up not having enough tonal variation, so it can end up looking a little flat or drab because I've been using the same colors a little bit too much. But yeah, it's basically just what I feel might be right for sort of any particular part.
Do you prefer paint color or black and gray? It seems like you always paint color, but a lot of your stuff seems to be black and gray when you just need to get something to break out.
I definitely like painting in grayscale. So I guess I like painting in either, but I very rarely, if something is going to be color at the end, I very rarely start grayscale and then like colorize it, which I think is partly just because I prefer starting off, even if it's starting off in fairly muted tones. Like this basically started off in sort of a greenish brown, and it, for all intents and purposes, probably could have been started off in grayscale, and I would end up in a pretty similar position. It's just a little simpler to end up where you want to be quicker, rather than doing the rendering out. And it's not necessarily something I'd suggest. Like, I think working in grayscale to begin with can be really good to get like tones and shadows and values right, but I think I haven't really found a lot, like a really good way of colorizing something that I've painted in grayscale, so it always just ends up looking a little too sort of gray and muddy, and I end up having to sort of repaint a little bit too much of it anyway. Though that is a little different, obviously, with depending on how much line work I need to have put in to begin with. Like, because I pretty much entirely do any line work that I need to do will be done in black, because it's easier to think about. And so that obviously I start painting over. But then that just ends up being a little bit more of a stylistic thing. So I'm not going to paint over like line work like this. So I end up just having sort of chunkier shadows and some dark outlines left over, which is fine for the final look that I go for.
So you said you leave your brushes at 100%, and there's obviously a lot of subtle transparency going on. Is that all fine motor control, or is there a setting?
Yeah, basically. I mean, I have, I guess I didn't do any changes to the default thing here, so it's pretty much just based on how hard I'm pressing. Though I will, like, if I want to make a large area sort of softly covered, instead of adjusting the transparency, I actually make the brush bigger, so that way I don't have to do like a lot of noodling at low pressure. I can just sort of do like a light big splodge, and that way it can cover the area instead of having to like do sort of something like that. And then that's the other thing is the gradient tool. I use that a lot for if I need a sort of soft, subtle color variation in something, then basically the gradient tool, I'll add that in. And then sometimes I will like start a new layer and add gradient in so that I can erase away if it's an area specifically that I don't want like the full glowing gradient across everything. So I will sometimes, like for the red nose, I've adjusted my opacity so it was 20% there. But yeah, for the most part, there's very little adjustment. So, in a piece like this, where I'm not necessarily sure where I'm ending up, choosing colors and stuff is definitely just more of a experimentation. Sometimes I'll have a really set idea in mind of like a color scheme or something. In this instance, I did a quick sketch just on some paper upstairs before I came down here, and so I had like a line basis, so I had basically a composition sort of planned out, but I didn't have any a color scheme worked out for it. And so sometimes it works in completely the other direction. Like I'll have seen someone's art on DeviantArt or whatever, and I'll be like, that's a really cool sort of color combination or something like that. Or I've seen a photo of something, or I've seen something in real life that I was like, oh, that seems like a cool combination, and I'll use those colors and just be like, all right, what is this going to be? And usually it's a robot, because that's sort of a good thing, an easy thing to make any color. So that's always fun to play around with. But
design-wise, are you conscious of like silhouette and like overlaps and scale and those sorts of things?
It's not often that it's something that I consciously think about. Though I think at this point I have a sense of composition that takes those things into account to some degree. And so while I'm not necessarily like, okay, this needs to sort of overlap here, or this will swing around and go behind there. I think when I'm doing the loose sort of underdrawing like this, a lot of the time I will end up fiddling around with it until my mind basically thinks like, oh, that's a sort of, that composition seems to be working, and I think those things are in the end taken into account, even though I didn't think about them like one at a time to get to that end result. And it's something I do. I will end up, if I start off with a really loose sketch like that, some things that work in the sketch, or I think work in the sketch, don't necessarily translate the same way into the final image, and so I'll end up like compositionally, some things look like they won't overlap, but then I end up drawing them, and because the proportions on the sketch maybe are not quite like symmetrical enough, and then when I fix that up, it turns out it does actually not work, or something needs to be tweaked or whatever. So that can be sort of annoying later in the process, but most of the time it's not necessarily something I think about too much.
When you were first learning, were you more conscious of those things, and that's just something you...
Not really. I mean, I never, I don't think I ever was specifically tried while I was learning to pick up like compositional things all that much. I guess it was a lot more about just drawing specific things. I did a little bit because I did a graphic design degree at uni rather than like a painting or any sort of game design or game art degree. There was a certain element of all of that stuff in like layout design and that sort of stuff. So I think that probably did help, but not in like a here's how you set up your composition for a nice illustration direct type way. Which, that said, maybe I should have, and maybe that would have been a good thing to do, and it would have helped me like along the way. I would have ended up where I am sooner or something. I'm not sure. But it's the same as the like whether I should be doing more studies of hands or I should be doing. There's always more things that I could be working on, and as long as I'm at least doing something all the time, I don't feel too like I'm slacking off too much.
What are some of the particular challenges that you've found working in games in terms of iterating on designs to get just the right look, or the playability of something from high perspectives? Is there anything like that that's particularly a challenge every time?
I think the playability and the readability, specifically working on StarCraft, is definitely something, and that's probably the biggest thing as far as like it being a challenge to go from designing something that works like from a sort of horizontal perspective or whatever into something that looks good at a really small scale and from a very high up angle. Though it's not necessarily like there haven't been too many times, I suppose, where I've done like a design and been like, oh yes, this is gonna look great, and then it ends up being viewed from completely wrong angle and not looking great. But I suppose that is just something I always need to keep in mind. As far as other parts of the sort of artistic process for game design, I'm not especially sure about something specific that I need to sort of that I think of as a challenge. I think level of detail is definitely something, and that does definitely tie in to the readability from game view, and I think that also plays into just general style of Blizzard, particularly like often if I'm doing something, I have to make sure I remember to keep like things not too noodly, and from that works from both well, if you don't have too many small details, something will read better from the game camera, and if you make the details cool and chunky and not too scribbly, then it fits in with the sort of Blizzard art style a lot better. So it's sort of a double win in that perspective. But again, it's not always something I need to think about consciously too much, like 100% of the time. Sometimes something won't quite be working, and I'll have to look at it and be like, oh, that could actually be why it's not working, and I'll go back and turns out it was why it wasn't working or whatever. But I think also a part of that is the working on sort of the concept side of things. I think the artists that I work with who do the 3D like production side of it have a very good grasp on that stuff as well. And so if, say, the concept was a little too noodly or something, then when it comes to the 3D side of it, it's easy for them, and they like the talent and confidence just to be like, well, this is gonna work, and I'm gonna have to change these 3 spikes into like one big spike, or I'm gonna have to adjust this bit to read better or whatever. And there's no real like ownership or anything, which is fine. I'm not gonna be like, what? Why are there not 3 spikes? Those 3 spikes were crucial to the design.
Have you ever actually had any challenges drawing any subject matter?
Oh, all the time. I mean, there's an eternal struggle with hands and feet, which is never ending, basically. And then I think various animals can be a massive pain, which goes back to anything sort of anatomical. So even animal anatomy, like horses or that sort of. Not that I get called upon to draw too many horses in the course of my day-to-day work at Blizzard, but that's like definitely not something that's easy to do. I think personally that the human figure is definitely still just a constant challenge. Like there's always more to learn and always more progress to be made doing that. And sometimes things just work better than others. Like I could be happy one day with the drawing I did of like someone. I got the hands really nice, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm finally starting to get it. And then the next day, like, all right, do something else, and then they just won't work. And I'll try and try and try, and they just won't work. And so I think it's a little bit individual there as well. There are other things like I think on a not so much drawing but general sort of painting side, there's so much to learn, like lighting and sort of compositionally, like getting things to look nice. If you're doing full illustration as opposed to just like a character piece, or yeah, like a concept of a character or a pinup of just a character, if you want to make a nicer sort of realistic looking image, or even not realistic but just a full scene or something, there's an entirely different set of skills there that need to be worked on. There's a million things that I could be working on at any one time, it feels like, and then I feel like I don't work on any of them, but I think I do. It's just you need to always be pushing yourself. I mean, if you're happy with where you are, you're probably deluded. So I mean, you've got to be able to be confident in your work. You're not supposed to be like, oh, everything I do is crap. But at the same time, that you should always be looking at ways that you can improve your work. And I do try and sort of focus on things that I know I have issues with. Maybe I don't quite do it as much as I should, but it is something I do try and do, which is good, and I would recommend that to anybody.
Do you have a favorite subject or character that you render?
Yes. Basically, this sums up what I like to draw, pretty much.
And for the company.
Oh, at Blizzard? Not the marine suit. At this point, I really like drawing Zerg stuff. It's why I got hired here initially to begin with, and I think that is a heap of fun. But I don't know. There's something just cool about Hydralisks that you sort of can't get past. I mean, I've had a heap of fun now that we're working on Heroes of the Storm. I've been getting to work on basically all 3 franchises, and so that's been really fun. Being able to work in. I'd been illustrating WoW cards for a while, and so there'd been a bit of crossover for a while. I got to scratch that fantasy itch a bit, but now I'm actually getting to do it more again, and that's a lot of fun. And so painting elves is nice, and painting big sort of guys with enormous shoulder pads that are not intricately sculpted mechanical things. They're like beaten out of metal, and you don't have to be quite so careful with your perspective of your curves and your panel lines. There's something sort of nice about that. But yeah, if I had to choose, it would be a Hydralisk every time.
In regards to stuff, when you've drawn pictures for WoW or D3, you seem to have like a really good sense of taking those designs, and even if they're low fidelity, you know, upraising them very appropriately, like it's WoW, making the armor extremely practical, or taking some of the really big shapes and rationalizing them. What's your thought process on how you approach that stuff? A lot of artists try that and they don't really succeed, especially in like the TCG where you see contract artists not pull it off.
I'm not too sure. I think it's being able to look at something like look at a low res thing and be able to extrapolate from there, especially with sort of the rest of the world or the style that you're aiming for in mind. Like just because you're up-resing it, you don't want to be making like a TCG piece like realistic, and so you have to keep within the style. And there's nothing specific that I really think about doing, but there's a lot of reference involved as far as like looking what's come before and fitting it, not only making it practical and sort of realistic to a certain degree, but fitting it in with the world that already exists, like the rest of the world art of, like, say I'm doing a character that has never been created like in high fidelity or whatever. There are lots of WoW characters who have been done to a super high level by Way or whoever, and so there's that to look at, and you can just be sort of extrapolate and find a sort of a middle ground between what exists and what hasn't. I mean, there's something enormously fun about even aside from how I go about it, which is sort of difficult to explain, I suppose. That's one of the things that I enjoy doing most. I mean, that's what I was doing. I was doing fan art before I ended up here. I was doing fan art of Zerg things that I was working off tiny low-res screenshots of in-game units that had been like cut out and blown up to whatever when StarCraft 2 had been first announced, and that was like amazingly fun, working out my sort of rational details for Zerg pieces or Zerg units and stuff like that. But I don't know. There's not really a how to go about it. I think part of it, maybe, it also comes from a long history of looking at Prometheus, Nicholas Jansen's work online. He's a guy, I'm sure a lot of you know of him, but I would recommend him as probably, well, he's definitely got the best digital art tutorial that I've ever seen, like that I have ever come across online. But he basically, that's all he does is reimaginings of old sort of games and bringing them into some sort of higher fidelity. And even if I don't necessarily try and do exactly what he does, having spent a lot of time looking at that sort of thing just sets your mind up to be in a sort of mode where it can do that a little better. And I guess that's part of like what fan art is. It's extra, because you're never gonna have, I mean, these days to a certain degree you are, but before this point there was never like a huge amount of art. You've got art from in-game of like whatever your favorite characters are or whatever, but they're never going to be in exactly like the pose you wanted or the scene you wanted. If you want to draw them again, there's always a certain amount of reimagining, if it's with your own style or if it's with more detail or less detail or a different type of thing. So it's fun. That was sort of a ramble, but whatever.
What are some things you've been really into or obsessed with
lately? Lately, this guy named oh god, Simon Stalenhag, I think. His stuff is really cool. Is a Swedish artist who does sort of sci-fi landscapes. The landscapes themselves are not especially sci-fi in a general sense, but he adds sci-fi elements to them, so it'd be like a fairly standard looking field or something, and then there'll be crazy sci-fi buildings in the background, and that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately. It's a really cool sort of juxtaposition there. As far as other stuff that I've been doing, I was playing the Banner Saga, and that is awesome, and that was pretty inspiring. So I've definitely done a few sort of Viking-ish inspired pieces that have come out of that.
For that chest piece, I saw that you kind of softened it. Do you use the smear tool for that?
Yes, I use the smudge tool quite a lot. And I try and keep that on a relatively low sort of strength, and I don't use it for big areas, but it's definitely, especially with skin and soft sort of round things, it's a great way of not especially because I don't really like switching back and forth between brushes that much. So I like switching to a different softer brush is sort of annoying when I can just instead paint with the square brush and then sort of smudge it a little bit and get the same result in a more efficient manner, I guess. Kevin, is this going till 8 or can I go longer?
However long you want it to go.
Alright, I'm not sure exactly. Where's that?
I know you could go all night, so it's up to you.
Might end up probably going to about 8:30. That seems like a reasonable. I'll be in a reasonable spot to stop at this about then. I don't necessarily like. I could is one of those things where I could keep drawing and keep adding detail and keep polishing it more and more. But a lot of the time, I like ending up keeping things pretty loose, and a lot of the time, I end up less and less happy with something, the more I render it. And that can sometimes be because I just overthink things, and sometimes I think that partly comes from a lack of planning initially. Because if I'm doing something like this, and I leave it sort of rough, and then I'm pretty happy with it. I'm happy with it for what it is, whereas if I start, because I don't necessarily think out a composition quite a lot, the longer I spend on something, the more I see that's wrong with it, and the later it is, the too late it gets more and more difficult to like tell myself, no, I can go back and change like the entire composition or whatever. So I think that if I spend a little more spend a little more time on my initial composition stages, sometimes my longer paintings might satisfy me a little more, but I don't know. I like working quickly anyway. When I'm doing something like this, unless it's a very specific thing, I pretty much have like just a really basic lighting setup. So it's pretty much from the front here, sort of top, and that's partly because I haven't done anything that has a really specific sort of cast shadow, except for a leg. It's the only real thing that's got any real directional shadow, and this here. Outside of that, it's pretty much a standard thing, and maybe that's something I need to play around with a little more, is trying to decide earlier on a more exciting or even just different lighting setup, and then trying to keep to that. But yeah, because I end up a lot of the time, if I'm starting off with something like this, it'll end up just being a pretty standard, like, oh, yep, top left lighting. That's where it comes from. Which is fine sometimes, and it lets you, not doing anything crazy, lets you focus on just the mechanical process of rendering something more, and so there's definite advantages there. You don't have to think about things quite so much, but at the same time, obviously, you're not practicing thinking about things, so when you are called upon to do something a bit more extreme, I guess, you don't necessarily have as much experience with that. So yeah, that is something I probably should work on a little more. Though sometimes, like if I start off with like a landscape or something, if I really don't know what I'm doing, and I start off just like throwing down quite a lot of color on the page, I can end up with sort of an interesting lighting situation just sort of by chance, which is something I do a lot, especially at the moment. I've been doing there's a website called Satellite Soda that's been doing a February drawing jam thing at the moment, and so I've been forcing myself to do at least something every day, and so a lot of the time I get home sort of late and just start smushing something onto the canvas, and it just sort of ends up with something. And again, that goes back to the my things don't necessarily work out as well because I haven't planned out my compositions ahead of time. So I can be happy with something as like a sort of rough painterly sketch, but if I feel like the longer I stick with something, the more the initial flaws in the composition stick out to me, and I get more and more annoyed with it. But I guess that's also something that I'm slowly working on. It's just getting better at that initial phase. So there's another example of my I have created a new layout for that stuff, the clothing, and so I can erase that without getting in the way of the hair or whatever. Though at the same time, like I'm starting to paint all over, so she's it's not like I go back to this original layer when I want to paint on the skin. It's just, okay, here's a new layer, time to start that.
Do you have a favorite color combination that you like to see? Like purple and green or something in composition?
Well, a lot of the time I will actually start off with a gray background, so I end up using gray and orange a lot, and I like that. I think it sort of gets done a little bit too much maybe, so I try to branch out a little bit. But a gray and then some bright color like an orange or a turquoise or something is always cool. Otherwise, no, I like fairly sort of monochromatic things if they are either actually gray or say like a tan green or a bluish slaty gray or something, and then a bright color like a yellow or an orange is always fun. It's just that pop of color, which helps, can be good compositionally too. If I get to the end, if I've been painting in grayscale and then I'm not exactly sure about the composition, adding some bright color towards the end can really mix up the composition and hopefully make something that if it wasn't working before, make it start working.
Before you started here, you used to do a lot of line drawing before you went into color. Can you talk to the transition you made where you just started doing this method where you dive in and really don't have as much of a line art process anymore? What was a big part of that shift?
A big part of that is probably just speed. For my personal art, I don't need it to things to be as polished in the end, and so I'll forego the line art phase because I end up, you get to a level where you can be like, okay, this is pretty much finished. It's like a rough sketch, but it's done. I can call it done and be happy with it. Whereas if I'm doing a line drawing, then there's a lot more time that goes into just the planning out phase. And yes, there is a certain level of efficiency because you've already worked everything out. So when you're painting it, you don't have to think about all your details and stuff then. But I think that was basically the reason. And so I will, when I'm doing something that needs to be finished to a higher level, like the WoW cards that I did, or sometimes with concept stuff that I do here, I will do more of a sketch first, and that lets me spend more time if I need to render something to a higher level. Lets me pay more attention to the rendering while I've worked out the details beforehand. And I think that especially comes through with the WoW cards or something like that, because they had if I'm working to an armor set that is very specific, it's like, okay, this is what it needs to look like, then I don't want to have to be trying to render it and trying to remember where all the details go at the same time. I can get all the detail planning out and make sure that everything's in the right spot and it's the right size, and I know where it's all going, and then when I'm doing the rendering, I can just follow that. Whereas if I'm doing something even like this, it's like, okay, I can just do sort of whatever I want, and I can change and add details. And because I don't need it to be rendered to a crazy too high a level, I can just do some rough like design changes as I go, and it's not as big a deal as needing to update stuff on something that needs to be finished up to like a WoW sort of illustration level. And I still go back and forth a bit. I still like doing line art, and so I definitely will do that some of the time. it is just a slower process basically to end up with something that I'm happy with, or that I feel is sort of finished. So especially for something like this, if I was doing like a neat line work pass initially, then I would be maybe getting that finished now, rather than having gotten stuck this far into the coloring stage. Though it basically is a similar process. Like if I have this this sort of, it's almost line work. There's some line work there to start with, and then instead of going to this stage, I would then knock this back and then do a tighter line work pass over the top of this, and then go into this. And so it's just an extra step in between that when I'm trying to do sort of a quick sketch, I don't feel the need for anymore. And it does, you do end up with a different style, and this is looking a little strange at the moment just because there was fairly heavy line work, or at least working out under drawing on the lizard, and really not so much of that on the girl. So there's a little bit of an odd contrast going on there, but it's alright. I'm not necessarily sure if it's super interesting or whatever, but basically all of my color choices come from the swatch palette. At home I have a slightly expanded swatch palette. It's nothing too crazy. It's just got a set of skin tones at the end that I draw from for doing sort of figures and stuff. And I use the HSB slider scale for any extra editing. I know there are a lot of artists who don't use the swatches at all and just start off with like just the color scale, but I find it handy to have the swatches just there, just for making quick color choices along the way. Does that look very green?
Yellow green.
What part are you asking about?
Yeah, just the whole thing. Really, I'm not sure. Not quite. Anyway, I can finish that. Yeah, it's looking a little different on the monitor, but I can tweak that. I mean, that's one of the things I was talking about. Even if that is just because of the monitor adjustment, like I have two monitors at home, and they are very, very different in color calibration, because one of them's just a dodgy, an actual TV that I just have hooked up to, and one of them's a really nice 27-inch like monitor, and so the difference between the two is sort of crazy, and I don't know, especially because most of my stuff, all my personal stuff, it's just getting put up on the web, and I'm not sure. It's always really hard to tell what people are going to be looking at your work through. And so I sort of try and average out what looks good between the two monitors. But I will, like, if something like this, because I color pick so much. If it does have a green tinge, everything I do basically ends up just pushing towards sort of the green end of the spectrum or whatever, and I will wait until the end and then just do a final color balance to pull the reds and blues up, or whatever needs to be pulled up. I can adjust at the end, and for some reason there'll be times when I've started off with like a very limited value range or something, maybe, or something that's quite sort of brownish and dull, and then I'll do halfway through I'll do a levels and I'll be like, oh man, that looks so much better, but then I guess this may be something I need to stop doing, but then I'll just delete the levels layer and keep painting in like this dull sort of green tinged painting mode, and then just at the very end I'll be like, okay, I know I can just change it at the end. Whereas I feel like it might be better for my color sensibilities if I made sure I was always painting in something that would look good at the end without having to rely on a levels layer and a color balance layer at the end to make it really pop out. I don't know. It's just something, but it's definitely something you can do. Like if you find that your work is tending towards like one, if you end up always painting something a little bit too orange or a little bit too green or whatever, don't be afraid of making even fairly drastic color balance changes towards the end of your piece. So like this, I guess I could do it now. You know what? So you go to levels. I always just do an auto levels thing to see what it does, because then like there's a lot of contrast that isn't there, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you don't want your stuff to always be like as contrasty as possible, but it does make a difference. And so you can, and so sometimes I either do some adjustments in the levels layer itself to end up being a little more neutral, and sometimes I'll do a color balance, which is good. And it is almost the same thing, really. I think you can pretty much get exactly the same result out of either of those. But so yeah, so that seems a little less green and a little more natural. And so normally I would, sometimes I would turn those off and keep painting like this, even though I know at the end I'm going to turn that back on. But today I'll start a new layer of that and start painting on top of this, the right colors. She should probably have a foot. See, that's when.
Dragon cut it off.
And so that's one of those situations where, as a sketch, this looks fine. All right, that works. But then I get to the rendering phase. I'm like, okay, now I draw and it's still probably gonna get cut off at the bottom of the page. Guess I could use this.
Whatever. Theater for people who can't fly, so you know.
Exactly. Maybe she just has stumps. I don't know.
You've got 15 minutes left, by the way.
All right.
I request a shark fin.
The eternal question. We'll see. Maybe.
Or like a tree branch or something.
Just hide it.
See, this is that question. You asked about what you have trouble with. This is that.
Not a Converse owner. I guess this is the right time to ask, what's your favorite curse word?
There you go. Perfect. You can't. The foot that. Now that I think about it, that calf is really weird too. I don't even know. Even high heels don't. This is what? Yes. Still no. I don't even. All right, I'll come back to that. That's what happens. Yes, I do have to get that. Guess I have to draw out a hand too. Crap.
You just lock transparency on the sphere with the shape, that shadow
Yeah.
line?
The / toggles transparency lock. Actually, it toggles whatever last layer lock you had, but I only ever use transparency. So, / So I definitely use that a lot as opposed to selections when I can. Super handy. Wow, that's really bad.
What are some things you try to consciously avoid in your drawings? For instance, Rob Liefeld will put his character standing in grass so he doesn't have to draw feet. What's something that you consciously kind of have to remind yourself, like, not to cop out on?
I mean, the main thing is usually hands and feet. I think outside of that, there aren't too many things I try and avoid, really. And I think it's even sometimes not necessarily avoiding, but it can be like not putting as much effort in, and you can sort of tell. Like, I sort of feel like sometimes I do things and I'm like, oh, I get away with that because it's painterly, but it's just me not wanting to paint something. But I think there are things like certain lighting situations that maybe I avoid. Like as I was talking about before, I end up doing pretty standard, just like top down sort of lighting situation, and that's something that I'm like, oh yeah, I could work on that, but I don't. And yeah, that is one of the things that I sort of have to consciously try and get over. Outside of that, I'm not sure. I think that's a big one. I really need to practice more expressions and stuff. My people end up doing almost the same thing a lot of the time, and I think I need to try and branch out a little bit. But
if you had as much time as necessary in this piece, is the back leg of the dragon something you leave like that or flesh out more?
it's pretty much something I'd leave like that. It might get a little bit more love, but basically it's that's especially because it's the, like, if anything, I would give the front legs more attention. The back, because it's like it's behind the wing, it's behind sort of the tree branch that's on. It's like this is sort of going on back there. That's the sort of thing that I would want to leave fairly subtle. The only thing that I would maybe work on more, I would be like neatening up the sort of rough edges and cleaning up the square. There wouldn't be any more actual detail in it. And that's definitely something I try and do, is make sure it's partly a stylization thing and partly a compositional thing. Is focus my details. And partly it's also there's a lot of benefits that you get out of it. One thing, it simplifies the painting process because you don't need to put like an enormous amount of detail into everything. So if you are more focused on what you want to put your effort into, then that cuts down your painting time, which is good. But it also means that the painting will read better because the composition will be less or more directed, because you've got certain areas that are obviously knocked back, it just draws your eyes to the bits that you wanted to draw your eye to, namely the bits that you spent the most time on, which is how it should be, really. Though at the same time, sometimes, depending on the sort of thing you're doing, sometimes you will have a really complicated background that you still need to have knocked back, so you may spend ages painting a forest that is still in a very like silhouette-ish sort of tonal range, but is quite detailed. So it has the time that you've had to spend doing that, but contrast-wise, it doesn't stand out, and that can be a trade-off there. But for the most part, especially for a quick painting like this, focus my time on the important bits and leave other bits subtle.
You get 5 minutes.
Alright. Pretty much hate the foot, but wow. And then sometimes I'll actually do so that's a quick mask thing that I did to select the left hand side of the image so that I can do levels that will only affect just because I feel there was a little bit too much weight on the right hand side and not really any going on over there. Alright, so that gonna work. And that's pretty much it. So now just to decide whether it goes that way or that way.
That way.
Alright. Alright, there you go. Any final questions?
So you said you look on DeviantArt a lot, right?
Yes.
Does that mean you have your own DeviantArt account?
Yes, I do.
Email.
Yes, it should be in the email. So
Do you have any like a YouTube channel or anything like that?
I do have a YouTube channel. I have not put anything on it for about 4 years. I get requests to do that quite a lot. So it's really something that I mean to look into. I haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah.
I should. So hopefully someday soon I will. And I'll update my DeviantArt page probably and say that. But yeah, yes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
F10.